Well, welcome everyone. I really appreciate you coming to lunch with me. It is Lunch and Learn Day for MAR, and today we are going to be talking about PFAS. I guess we'll defer to Suzanne and see what she decides to call it, but PFAS, PFAS. Suzanne Miller is the director of the Bureau of Remediation and Waste Management. Suzanne was appointed as the director in June 2021. She is responsible for all aspects of the DEP's programs for waste management, remediation, response services, petroleum management, and most recently, the implementation of the PFAS soil and groundwater investigation requirements by the 130th legislature. Prior to her current role, Suzanne served as the director for the DEP's Eastern Maine Regional Office in Bangor for 8 years. And Suzanne spent 10 years before that as an environmental consultant. Prior to that, she served as an environmental specialist for the Park Facility Management Division of the National Park Service in Washington, D.C., where she focused on facility compliance and waste sites. Welcome, Suzanne, and I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you very much for the welcome. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, so if everybody will bear with me for a second. Can everybody see that? Okay, great. So I've already had a nice welcome. Thank you very much, Carmen. And so I just wanted to go ahead and get started and talk to you all about PFAS, as this is a really hot topic in Maine. And I hope that you'll take the opportunity to ask as many questions as you come up with. We want to make sure to reach this particular audience of realtors, and I've been working on realtors this spring, just to make sure that you understand what's going on with PFAS and what kind of tools that you have at your fingertips that we can help you with. So with that, what is PFAS? So I call it PFAS, and that's pretty much what we generally call them. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So technically it should be PFAS and not PFAS, because there's lots of substances, not just one. There's actually like 9,000 or so by the last count I saw from the National Institute of Health. So there are a whole lot of them. There are a bunch of different compounds, and basically what makes them a PFAS is that in Maine it has a definition, and in Maine's definition is that each PFAS compound has one fully fluorinated carbon atom. So in this slide, if you look at the bottom, you'll see there's a couple different PFAS compounds. That's their chemical structure. And those little gray circles in the middle, that would be your carbon. So it's a carbon chain. And those little light blue circles would be your fluorines. And so basically that's what causes something to become a PFAS. It's very conceptual, we're not going to see that floating around in the sky or in our water or anything, but that's just basically how it's defined. And as I mentioned, there's thousands of these different types of compounds. That carbon fluorine bond that I was just talking about is really difficult to break, and it's really difficult to destroy. And we'll talk more about that in a couple minutes. But because it's so difficult to break and destroy, these compounds are pretty much ubiquitous in our environment and also in our blood. And that's why they're called forever chemicals. It takes a really long time for them to break down, if ever. And it takes a long time for them to get out of our systems. These compounds are used in a lot of consumer and commercial products. So that's why they're everywhere. So I just wanted to give you some examples of some of the products and the types of places you might find PFAS. So nonstick cookware is really Teflon, and Teflon was one of the first PFAS products that was put out onto the market, and that was as early as the 1940s. And that was soon followed by Scotchgard, which was also shortly created thereafter. And since then, a lot of different PFAS compounds have been used, and they've been used for a variety of different purposes. They're basically used to repel water and grease. So they're waterproof, grease repellent. You can see that with sort of that middle picture with the water that doesn't quite stick to the Teflon pan. Our Gore-Tex jackets and outerwear, rainwear, cosmetics, food packaging is a big one. So they're used in a lot of consumer products. These are just sort of the more common ones that we know that they're in. So why are we concerned about PFAS? Well, PFAS are linked with several health concerns, and this information comes from the US CDC. PFAS have been linked to increased levels of cholesterol, decreased response of vaccines in children, some other issues like decreased weight in infants, increased risks of testicular or kidney cancer, changes in liver enzymes, and some issues with pregnancy. And so this information comes straight from the US CDC. And I want to mention that PFAS is not just a problem here in Maine. We hear about it a lot in Maine because we hear about it in the news, but it's not just unique to Maine. It's happening everywhere around the planet because all these consumer products we use here are being used everywhere else too. And so this slide shows sort of what the life cycle is of PFAS. You know, basically it starts with our products and with our manufacturing, and from there it can make its way into our soil, our groundwater, our plants, water. And so it's a cycle that has to be broken, but it has not been broken at this point in time. And I want to mention too that this particular slide comes from Michigan. They had a really nice diagram here that I borrowed from them. And that just again goes to show this is not just a Maine problem. So you're probably wondering, so we have this problem, what do we do about it? And so there's a lot of technology that's being looked at, but we don't really have a great solution yet. What we do have is proven technologies to treat water, drinking water. We have something called granular activated carbon, ion exchange, and reverse osmosis. These are 3 methods for treating drinking water. Drinking water can be effectively treated to remove PFAS so that it's safe. That's a positive note. However, we don't really have a way yet that's been proven that is both proven and cost effective. So meaning that there is technology that we know will work, but we can't necessarily afford it because it's very expensive. So we don't have technology ready for full-scale operation for treating things like landfill leachate or milk or soil or other agricultural wastes, other types of wastes either. And so that's where the bulk of research is being done right now. So we can treat drinking water, but we don't really have technology yet that we know for sure is going to treat everything else. So there are different ways to look at how do we deal with PFAS. We can try to reduce the volume of it. So when you're talking about soil, there's a lot of soil everywhere, right? So does it make sense to dig up the first top layer of soil and then try to treat that? Or is there a way to kind of do some kind of pre-treatment that removes the volume of it? So you only have to actually destroy a smaller volume of it. So you can maybe concentrate PFAS using some of these technologies we already know about. Also phytoremediation, people talk about that, you know, where you would plant crops and the crops would uptake PFAS from the soil. That's a way to concentrate some of the PFAS into sort of a smaller amount. And so you could take that, and then from there, you'd have a smaller volume to actually destroy. And the destruction techniques all have stars next to them because they're not ready for prime time yet. However, when they do get up and running, they're going to be expensive to create. They're big infrastructure projects. And, you know, so if you have a smaller volume to work with, it'll be a little bit more cost effective in the long term. I only bring this up because, you know, you don't need to know all the details about this, but it's just important to know that folks are looking into this. A lot of really smart people, engineers, government officials up at the federal level, as well as the state level, are looking at these technologies and trying to figure out what's going to work. And here in Maine, we're specifically looking at what we can use for PFAS in terms of the biggest waste streams we have in our landfill leachate, for farm and agricultural products, and that sort of thing. So I want to talk a little bit about the legislatively mandated soil and groundwater investigation, because I think this is going to have a lot more to bear relating to real estate and real estate transactions. So back in 2021, the legislature required the department to conduct an investigation of soil and groundwater statewide based on licenses that authorize the land application of sludge and septage. So sludge is basically what's coming from your wastewater treatment plants. Septage is what comes from your backyard if you have a septic system. Sometimes with septic systems, your septic hauler will come and they'll pick up your septage, every few years to clean out your septic system. And in Maine, we still allow the land application of septage. That's still okay by law in Maine. And so that's what we're talking about here. Areas where septage or your wastewater treatment plant sludge was land applied, we're sampling those areas and looking at groundwater and soil contamination from PFAS from that. So half of all the sites that had land application of sludge or septage must be completed by the end of 2024, and the department is supposed to be concluding its investigation by the end of 2025. So that's a pretty short period of time, and you'll see why it's a short period of time in a couple slides. But for now, what we're looking at is the only standard that we really have. The only standard that we have is Maine's interim drinking water standard, which is set at 20 parts per trillion for the sum of these 6 PFAS listed in this slide. There are no standards for soil. There are no standards for landfill leachate. There are no standards for water coming out of a wastewater treatment plant. So the only standard that exists is for drinking water. And the good news, as I mentioned with that, is at least we have treatment for drinking water. So that's good. However, there's all these other sources of PFAS that we don't have regulations for or standards for at this time. I want to mention the EPA health advisories below, because the EPA was supposed to set a draft drinking water standard nationally. They were supposed to release it in December. We're now being told it's going to be released early March, so maybe by next week. And the likelihood is that whatever that number is that they release is probably going to be lower than the state's standard of 20 parts per trillion. And that's going to have a big effect on, how we manage PFAS at the state level. We're going to have to reevaluate how we're looking at everything, including our investigation, but also how we're working with public water lines as well. And so it's going to have a really big impact. And the health advisories that the EPA set out June of 2022 are really, really low. You can see these numbers that they have compared to the number that Maine has above. There's orders of magnitudes. There's a bunch of extra zeros in front of them. And so these interim drinking water standards are very, very low. In fact, they're so low that laboratories can't even detect them yet. And so there's some questions about that. How do you enforce a standard that a laboratory can't even test for or get results for accurately? So, gut feeling is that the lowest that the EPA will go with its new draft level standard will probably be around the level at which a laboratory can actually have, verifiable results. So,
Suzanne, may I interrupt? We did
Absolutely.
have a couple of questions. One was, how many facilities in Maine currently exist that test for PFAS? And what is the typical turnaround for time for the results to come back? And then what are public water supply companies doing to address PFAS?
Okay, so we'll start with the labs and turnaround time. So we do not have any laboratories in the state of Maine that actually directly do the analysis in Maine. However, there are about 6 or so laboratories that the state contracts with nationally. They're well-known laboratories, they're big laboratories, and you can ship samples to them and they will do the analysis, and that's perfectly acceptable. There are some companies in Maine, and we have these on our website for those of you that are interested, that allow, what they'll do is they'll collect samples, they'll charge sort of an extra fee, and they'll package up the samples and ship them off for you. So that's an option if people are uncomfortable with doing the shipping and packaging on their own to ship off samples. The other thing I want to mention is that during the last legislative session, the legislature authorized $3.2 million to get laboratory access in Maine for PFAS sampling. There are 2 contracts underway, with one with Katahdin Laboratories and one with Bigelow Laboratory, and they are both going to be, they are both in the process. The contracts I think have been signed, and they are both in the process of getting PFAS analytical sampling within the state's borders. And so that'll be something probably about a year or so out, but it will be up and running, soon, hopefully. And then the second question was about, sorry, you have to refresh my memory on that one. I'm sorry.
Public water,
Okay.
public water supplies. What were they doing?
Yeah, couple things with public water. So public water, just so everyone knows, is actually handled out of a different agency than the Department of Environmental Protection. So the Department of Environmental Protection is looking primarily at private drinking water wells. The Maine Drinking Water Program, which is part of the Maine CDC, has the Maine Drinking Water Program, and they focus on things like public water systems, public water lines, and water that would be impacted by PFAS in those scenarios. The drinking water program has been sampling public water systems at schools and daycares. That information's on their website, so people can get that information publicly. Public water districts tend to do the sampling already on their drinking water lines. And so that is something that I would advise realtors to reach out to the drinking water program if you want more specific information. Okay, so moving on with the Department of Environmental Protection's investigation, we are looking at soil and groundwater, and groundwater is basically private drinking water wells. So we basically go and test private drinking water wells to understand what's going on with the groundwater. Soils, we do soil sampling. And so we anticipated when the legislation was first passed that we had about 700 sites, but we actually have increased that number to about 1,000. Let me explain why that happens. That happens because these are all based on licenses that were issued from the department for the land application of either sludge or septage. These licenses have been issued since the late 1970s. The US federal EPA had encouraged this program because what it did was it allowed agricultural land in particular to get additional nutrient value back into the soil, and it was a way to deal with sludge. And there were provisions, there were contaminants that were tested for, but up until the teens in the 2000s, nobody was really looking at PFAS, and this is nationally. Also, sludge and septage application was also used for things like landscaping. So, like one of the big things that were touted in the original 1980s documents from the EPA is that they use it at Disneyland, for example, to do all the landscaping at Disneyland. So it was a very common practice, and it wasn't just in Maine, it was done throughout the US. But when you're looking at licenses for 4 or 5 decades ago, the information can be a little spotty. And so it's taken a long time to get through the records. We're still looking through many records and trying to get as much information as possible. Records include things like licenses, annual reports, any other correspondence that came from those who were authorized to land apply sludge, as well as lot owners who accepted and authorized sludge and septage to be spread on their properties. And so it's important to know that a lot of land application areas are now owned by different owners. And so there's been a lot of changes over the past several decades. So trying to get, who the new landowners are in relation to where the license authorized spreading has been, pretty tricky. A lot of times sites include multiple fields and locations. And I think that's really important. When we talk about the word site, we're not just talking about one little field that we're doing 1 or 2 samples, often multiple fields, lots of acreage. That's because a lot of farms would cover lots of fields that weren't necessarily contiguous, that crossed municipal boundaries, crossed town boundaries, sometimes they were leased by other owners. And so there's a lot of confusion, and it's taken a lot of time to get through and figure out where all these sites are. And like I said, we're still working on that now, even after several years of trying to track all this information down. We also know that there were some sites that were used by multiple generators. So maybe you had a farm with, say, 5 fields, but 2 of the fields had maybe 1 generator, 2 of the fields had another generator, and then the 5th field had both on the same location. So again, how things were going to be affected might be different within the same site. And as I mentioned, lot sizes and land ownership have changed. So we've had situations where, for example, one large farm might now be, say, 2 organic farms and maybe a development. So we've been going around to all of these locations and we've been sampling. And what we found generally right now, is that 77% of the groundwater samples that we've taken are lower than the state's interim drinking water standard. So what that means in really simple terms is that 77% of the groundwater wells right now fall below the state standard, which means it's safe to drink. The remaining 23% are higher. We do have some parts of the state where we found exceptionally high levels of PFAS. So remember that state drinking water standard is 20 parts per trillion. There have been some homes that have been in the tens, if not closer to 40 trillion parts per trillion, and that's really high. Generally, anything over 1,000 parts per trillion, we refer right over to the Maine CDC so that they can talk with homeowners. Under that, the department will do some more work to try to figure out what the source is and determine a little bit more about, what the cause might be and what if there needs to be more investigation. But that's generally the role of the department, and that's generally the breakdown of what we're finding so far. And just sort of as a general sense of numbers, in the first year of the investigation, we covered about just over 1,500 samples, and as of the last count, I think we're closer to like 1,750 samples of groundwater at this point in time. Soil. So we're also sampling for soil. We've collected over 400 soil samples. As I mentioned earlier on, there's no standard for soil, so it's really difficult to explain to folks what does it mean if you have a number in your lab report that says I have X amount of parts per billion of soil. What does that really mean? And so there's no easy answer for that, but I think the key thing for folks to know is that it really depends on what you plan to do with your soil. If you're using it for a residence, that's one thing. We do have some screening levels at the department for residential use. We have some screening levels for recreational use. So that would be like parkland or recreational trails, that kind of thing. We do have screening levels for construction sites, and that's to protect construction workers. What we don't have at the Department of Environmental Protection is screening levels for agricultural use or for gardening. Those are the kinds of things you'd want to go to another agency for. If you have a farm, for example, and you're doing a transaction with a farm, you're going to want to talk to the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, because they're going to have more information about screening levels for vegetables, and they're going to have more information about what how PFAS might have an impact to livestock. If you're looking at a home garden, that's something we would recommend you talk with the Maine CDC, because they can talk to you more about what exposure levels mean when it comes to soil and vegetables and gardening and that sort of thing. So I want to take it to a point where we can talk about tools. Homeowners can do their own sampling. We do have some guidance on the DEP website in terms of how to do your own water sample and how to do your own soil sampling. If you go to the Maine PFAS website, the front page is going to look like this up below. I've got the website here, and I'll be providing the PowerPoint, and we'll also post it up on our website. But you can link right to our PFAS website, and when you get there, if you click on the little line that says data and guidance at the end, you can see there are some links to PFAS water sampling for homeowners, soil sampling for homeowners, and information for self-testers. I encourage you to all take a look at that, and that's something you can provide to your clients as well. So basically, there's instructions on how to collect a water sample. There are instructions on how to collect a soil sample. It kind of explains how the process works. There's information about laboratories. There are laboratories you can call that will collect the sample for you in state and then ship them off for you. Generally, a cost of a sample we anticipate to be in the $300 to $500 range for the sample itself. However, if you have a lab that's collecting them for you and doing the packaging and shipping, they might charge you a little bit more. And so we do have that guidance available. I do want to mention there are very specific instructions about trying to not cross-contaminate your samples. Taking a PFAS sample is very different than taking like a sample for arsenic or something else. PFAS is in everything. It's in all our clothing, it's in our pens and our paper, it's in certain materials. And so basically what will happen is when you contact the lab, they'll send you a package of information as well as containers to use for collecting a PFAS sample. And you really need to be careful not to cross-contaminate that stuff. You want to wear the right clothes while you're taking the sample, and you want to make sure that you're not mixing or having those containers, touch anything that might have PFAS on it, because that can affect your sample. All of that's spelled out in the instructions. And if you have any questions or your clients have any questions, they can contact us at the DEP, and we're happy to walk through that process.
Quick question on the testing. You've mentioned cost. We've had a couple of questions about, do you have any idea how long the turnaround to get results is?
So it depends on the lab, and it depends on how many other samples they're getting right now. There's a lot of demand for sampling just from the state, and that's just Maine, but there's also, all the other states are doing a lot of sampling on PFAS too. So the turnaround can be as much as a month. It just depends on what company you're working with. Sometimes it can take longer. I will say water samples are a lot faster than soil or other types of samples. Our sister agencies over at Ag, they're trying to do sampling for like animal tissue, and that's taking a really long time to turn around. So water tends to be the fastest, but you could be waiting a month or longer. Okay. Seller disclosures. So I wanted to really emphasize this point because this is probably the question you probably all have, and that is that it is not specifically required to disclose PFAS. However, as you know, and it's in your property disclosure form, the seller is required to disclose any malfunctions of a private water supply system, the date of the most recent water test, and whether the seller has experienced problems. So I think it's open to interpretation as to whether or not, you have to disclose a PFAS test if it's been taken. And I just, I'm not going to answer that definitively. That's not my but I do want to point this out to you that this is what the language of the statute requires for water. This is what's in your disclosure form, but it does not specifically call out PFAS. So thinking about property transactions, clearly PFAS is something that's on a lot of folks' minds right now. There are a lot of questions coming. We get a lot of questions daily. People are concerned about safe drinking water. So to that, I would let you know, we do have solutions for safe drinking water. There's filtration systems. They are proven to work. So drinking water is something that can be remedied. However, soil is not necessarily something we're clear on how to remedy at this point in time. And we also don't have standards for soil. So there's some uncertainty with soil. So I guess, some of the questions you might ask your clients, especially if they're buyers, are what are they planning on doing with their property? Are they planning on doing some gardening? Do they have pets? Do they have children they expect are going to be playing in the soil? Are they going to be farming or creating any agricultural products? Those are the kinds of questions you might want to ask, and that they may want to look into some more. If they're concerned about exposures, they can, self-testing can be done. They can also contact, and they should contact, the Maine CDC. Any information about exposures or health-related concerns should go to the Maine CDC. But I think, if you focus your conversation on intended uses, that might help both your your clients, buyer and seller clients, feel a little bit better about what what they have. PFAS in the soil and in the water does not need to be a deal breaker, especially if it's a residential home and people want to have a house. They know that they can have safe drinking water. So the question really is going to boil down to soil and uses of soil. We also have a mapping tool, which I'm going to show you in just a little bit, that can help you identify where the investigation in the state has been. And so you can look at the map and get a sense of what's going on nearby to an area that you may be doing some work in. There is not PFAS everywhere in Maine. It's not uniform in Maine. It's not a problem everywhere in Maine. And so we're focusing on areas that are close by to our licensed land application sites, the sludge and the septage application sites. We also have some PFAS that are associated with other remediation type sites. So some old military sites near closed municipal landfills as well, there may be PFAS. And so those are some other areas we're looking at groundwater. But it's not that there's contamination of PFAS everywhere in Maine. And I think that's really important. So if you take a look at our map, and I'll show you again that at the end of the presentation, that might help you, drill down a little bit more as to what's going on in a specific area. I will mention we only have a year's worth of data up there so far, so it's not a complete map. It's going to be, it's continually being updated. And so if you do still have questions, you can always reach out to us. So I think I already mentioned this. If you are selling or looking to buy property, you want to find out where your water source is. If it's a public water system or public water line, again, you want to contact the Maine Drinking Water Program, part of Maine CDC. But if it's a private drinking water well, the Department of Environmental Protection, like I said, that's what we're looking at as part of our investigation. We're not looking at every well in the state. We're only, we are only mandated to sample groundwater at those locations that are associated with sludge and septic sites or other remediation type sites. But we are not doing every well in the state. My understanding is there's close to 370 private drinking water wells in Maine. If you extrapolate all those costs out, that would cost the state billions of dollars basically to do. So we have to be somewhat limited in the sampling we can do. However, we do have, for folks who are looking at property transactions, self-sampling is an option. What we do know is that if you do have a impacted water well, homeowners can use filtration systems to make their water safe. If the property is part of the department's investigation and it qualifies for a filtration system, the department will pay for the filtration system and the ongoing monitoring and maintenance until such time as the money runs out for this program. If the well is sampled, but it's not part of the department's investigation and it doesn't qualify to become part of the department's investigation, that is still a cost a homeowner can take on themselves. They'd have to pay for the installation, ongoing filter changeouts, and monitoring. And so that's going to be an added cost, and I'll go through that in just a second. So here are some average costs. What the department generally uses is granular activated carbon GAC systems. These are very commonly used. These are the rates the state has for each of those systems. So an installation can be, on average, is about $3,400. However, some homes will need a pre-treatment system. For example, if you have well water and it's high in iron or some other metals, you may need to get a pre-treatment system put in if you don't already have one. That can be about another $3,500. Some homes are really small so that there's not enough room for the pre-treatment system to be, or the filtration system to be in their home. So we've had to install sheds. So for example, like a trailer home wouldn't have enough space inside. So the department has had to install sheds to those folks to have, adequate filtration system and have clean water. Sheds can be expensive, about $8,700 is generally what we've been paying. And then you have to add in the costs of filter changeouts and regular sampling. Depending on how high the level of PFAS is going to depend on how many filter changeouts you need. So if your PFAS level is just over 20, just over the state drinking water standard, you're probably not going to need a lot of filter changeouts because that's relatively low. If you're in the tens of thousands, for example, you're probably going to need more frequent filter changeouts. Can be more like 4 or 5 times a year, and those costs can add up. Sampling, basically, you need to do sampling after a few months the system's been running to make sure it's working properly. And so again, those sampling costs can add up as well. Basically, the sampling will help determine how often you have to do your filter changeouts. And so, whoever you hire to do that work, will basically be able to help you with that. So back to PFAS and soil, like we talked about before, finding out what the intended use of the soil is going to be. For example, there's a difference between having vegetable gardens versus ornamental gardens. If you're planning on eating your vegetables, you may have some concerns about that. If you're just having an ornamental garden, maybe you're not as concerned about the PFAS in the soil. Children or pets at play, are they going to be in the dirt? Is the soil contaminated everywhere or just in certain areas? So that could answer some questions. Are you planning on using the property for any kind of agricultural use? Is it a farm that you're working with? That's going to give you some different information to work with, and you're going to have some different questions to ask. So as I mentioned, we have a mapping tool and guidance on the website. So let's look at the website. This is the front page of the website for the DEP's PFAS website. If you click on the link that says, "Where is PFAS in Maine?" you will come up to a list of information, and the first thing you'll see is a link to the PFAS investigation mapper. When you press the PFAS investigation map, this is what's going to come up. you'll basically be able to put in a town in Maine and click, the search button, and it says, and then you'll get to your area just using Google Maps essentially. And if you scroll down deep enough, you can see that we're in Unity Township right now. And you can see that there's all sorts of information on this map. There's some hectagons, and there's some red and green dots, and there's some blue diamonds. So basically your red dots and your green dots are going to tell you how water wells sampled. Did they sample above or below the state's interim drinking water standard? Remember, that's that 20 parts per trillion number. If it's green, it means it's safe, it's under the level. If it's red, it means it tested above the level. And so to that end, those red dots that have blue diamonds around them, those show that those locations have filtration systems that have been installed. And then you see there are some little shapes in the key. There's septic land application sites and sludge utilization sites. And so if you go over to the diagram, you can see this was a sludge site up here, right where this odd shape is. And I don't know if we have I don't see a septic site up here. So these were all sludge sites. These are all the areas that are outlined in yellow where we license authorized the land application of sludge. And what's filled in sort of this bluish color are areas where we've confirmed that there's actually was sludge application or septic application, depending on what type of site you're looking at. When you click on any of these, whether it's a shape to know where the sludge application is or the dots, you click on the dots, you're going to get a little call out box like this, which is going to tell you what kind of well it is, where it is. It's going to give you the date the sample was taken, and you can find out what the sum of 6 concentration was. So in this particular home, it was at 4,600 or so parts per trillion. This call out here is a little bit different because this one shows soil. And in Maine DEP, we have 3 screening levels for soil for PFOA, PFOS, and PFBS. Those are 3 different compounds, and we've identified what the levels were at this location. So let's say you were selling a property and it just happened to be on this road. You could look on this road, get all this information, and get a little bit of sense of what's going on in that particular area. Like I said, other areas of the states, you might not see a whole lot. There may not have been any sludge application or licenses authorized in those areas, in which case you should be fine. Or it may be that we haven't done the sampling there yet, in which case you'll probably see some of these shapes outlined, but you might not have the data up there yet. We encourage you to take a look at the sludge and the PFAS investigation map, see if you can find what you need on it. And then if you haven't and you need additional assistance, we welcome you to contact us at the department, and we're happy to help you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation, and just please note this email address. It's a lot easier for the department staff to respond to this email address than it is by phone call, because certain staff know more about certain aspects of the investigation than others, and this allows us to quickly get this to the right person. So we encourage you to send an email on this. We have 2 staff people that are required to check this at least daily to farm these inquiries out. And so, we're happy to help. Please use that email address. It's going to be your fastest turnaround time for a response. And, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're happy to help you. And with that, I want to really thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. And I'm sure there's a lot more questions, and I'm happy to answer them.
So are you ready for the hot topic go around here? Let's see how many we can get through. Has the government stopped putting PFAS in the grounds of farmers in Maine? Okay, so the answer to that question, there's a bunch of different ways to answer the question. The fast answer is that the legislature banned the land application of sludge. That started August 8th, 2022. Land application of septic has not stopped because there are logistical issues. And in fact, there's logistical issues with the sludge ban that we're dealing with. Actually, within this past week, we've been dealing with it and trying to find a place for this stuff to go. In addition, the problem doesn't end until
the PFAS are taken out of the products, right? And so that's the key issue. Maine did pass a law in 2021 requiring the reporting of PFAS in products. Manufacturers are supposed to notify Maine beginning in January of this year what's in their products. This is all PFAS in all products. And there are rules going into place in terms of getting that information. Some information has been coming in. Some of the manufacturers or users of PFAS in products have requested extensions, which have been granted. However, Maine is the first state and the only state to do this so far. California has required some legislation on labeling of products, but I don't know that it's kicked in yet. So really, Maine is way ahead of everybody else on this. We're way ahead of the federal government. And so it's no surprise that it's difficult to get this information. And not only is it difficult to get the information, we're still working with our partners on a database to hold all this information and to be able to sift through all the information. But in the long term, the plan was to get all this information, find out what products have PFAS in them, and then the state can go ahead and start to ban PFAS from products where it's just not required or not necessary, essentially. But the reality is that by reporting the information, a lot of the manufacturers are going to feel some pressure to remove them. And that's why there's so much, I would say, consternation from that industry to not report the information as long as they don't have to. That's not to say that not everybody's doing that. I mean, we are getting information. So it just depends on, the different industries and their interests. But we are already getting information submitted.
Terrific, thank you. Is municipal wastewater sludge higher in PFAS contamination than paper mill sludge?
We don't have the information necessarily to answer that question. What I can tell you is that it's not a given that all industrial sludges are higher in PFAS than non-industrial sludges. Just by quick reference, the state of Vermont did a study and they actually found that some of the highest levels of PFAS were actually coming from non-industrial sources. So it depends.
Okay. You have given us, thank you, quite a lesson on the mapping, but we've had a couple of questions that you've referenced highest levels. Do we have areas of Maine or specific towns that you would consider to have the highest levels of PFAS that you've tested so far?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I don't want to throw any one town under the bus or anything like that, but I think it's pretty common knowledge that Fairfield has had, the Fairfield area communities like Fairfield, Benton, Unity Township, Oakland have had some of the higher levels of PFAS found in the state so far.
Okay. Do we have, no, let's do this one. Have domestic animals or wildlife such as deer, black bear, moose, wild turkeys been tested for PFAS? If so, what were the results?
So both of those questions, those are great questions. Domestic animals like livestock and ag products are being tested by the Department of Agriculture, and wildlife are being tested by the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. There are PFAS in all of the above. Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife has had some advisories put out for deer in the Fairfield area, as many of you are probably aware. There have been some fish advisories, I think, that the Maine CDC put out. As far as farming and livestock, the Department of Agriculture works very closely with the farms, both because of milk and beef and people eating those things. And so if you have any specific questions about those numbers, information about that, you should contact one of those two agencies.
Thank you. What about, so you talked to us about the filters and changing out the filters. And so what happens when you change out your filter? Where does the filter go that has the PFAS in it?
That's a great question. So right now, there's no way to destroy of PFAS, as I mentioned at the beginning when I talked about all the different technologies that we're still researching. So the best solution for the time being, which is not a great solution, is to landfill PFAS waste. And so basically all PFAS waste has to go to the landfill.
Interesting. So your map is from sites that you're testing. If somebody gets a private test done, is there any reporting requirement for that?
There's no reporting requirement, and that was one thing I forgot to mention that I wanted to say, is that if you do have homeowners that are doing self-sampling, if they're willing to share their results with the department, we welcome those because we will include them on the map. If they want them on the map, if they don't want their information on the map, then that's their, then they shouldn't share their information with us. But we would like to have the information because it gives us more information about the overall investigation. And it allows us to do more research and, take more samples as needed. So for example, if you had somebody that, I would say this to all of you, because this really is up to your homeowners and your buyers, whether they want to share the information or not, because it is public, and anything public that's given to the state is public information. So, I want to be clear about that. However, I would encourage, if you do have any high results of PFAS, like maybe 500, or definitely if anything over 1,000, they should share it with the department because they should have a consult with the Maine CDC.
Got it. How often do you update the map?
I think it's every couple weeks. I think we're trying to work on getting it up in real time, but I don't know that we're quite there yet.
And then, can PFAS be released when taking a shower and inhaled?
I would ask that question to the Maine CDC. My understanding is that the greatest source of exposure is through ingestion. So that would be by drinking water or eating, products or foods with PFAS. I think the risk of inhalation and or absorption of your skin is lower. But again, I would check with the Maine CDC on that. That's their area of expertise.
I mentioned the question about, does a property owner have a responsibility to report, or what were you calling them? Self-tester. Does the company that does the testing, do they have any requirement to report?
No.
Okay. Does PFAS come from human waste?
Yes, because it's in all of our bodies. I think they did a study back in '99, and like 98% of the human population on the planet has it in their bodies. So we all have it in us. It depends on, how much we're individually exposed to it, but it absolutely comes from us. And in fact, that's one of the areas we think, we don't know enough yet to demonstrate it, but we think that we have found some locations where we can't identify a source of land spreading or any remediation site nearby, but there might be a home that has some high levels or levels that are just over 20 parts per trillion affecting their property. And the only known type of possible source is the septic system.
Are overboard discharge systems included in the testing sites?
No, I don't believe so. That's more of a wastewater discharge, and those sites, let me check into that. That's a really good question. I know we are doing some sampling of wastewater effluent. I don't know that we're looking at OBW sites. So whoever asked that question, that's one I cannot answer, and I'm going to look into it.
Okay, I'll write down who that was. And if it is indeed all over in our everyday products, how much should we worry about playing in the dirt in our own yards?
That's a question that's up to your individual homeowner to decide. At this point in time, like I said, there's no standards really or regulation for that to help guide us. So that's going to have to be, based on an individual's interpretation of what their threshold is. So some people are going to be really concerned about this and others aren't.
And the last question that I have is, could you please share the link to the map again?
Yeah, I'll be sharing I'll send a PDF of the presentation over to, I think Claire and I were in contact. And so she can provide that to everybody, and the link is going to be in the PowerPoint.
Yep. That's what we had for questions.
Well, that wasn't too bad.
I actually have a question, and I don't have, because I'm a presenter, I don't have access to the chat. My question is, do you know what the absorption rate is for humans and animals?
Yeah, I don't know that. Yeah, that would be a good CDC question.
That's a CDC question. Okay,
yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, anything about like human health exposures and health effects and anything like that, because those are the kinds of questions a lot of people want. That's not like the department can't really help with that. So that's the main CDC. They have toxicologists that can help with human exposures and animal exposures and things like that.
We're getting feedback that we thank you very much. It's a very informative session.
Well, I appreciate reaching out to you. I highly encourage you to send an email to this email link that I've still got up. If you have questions, we're happy to help out. And, you know, we've been getting a lot of questions over the years from realtors, and we're now in a place where we can give a little bit better advice than we could at the beginning. It's taken a while to just even get to the point where we're at now. So really appreciate your patience, really appreciate your interest, and happy to answer any questions as you have them.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for coming and talking to us today. I'm really very happy with the content, and you've answered our questions wonderfully. Even if the answer was, you know, you're going to talk to the CDC, that's an answer. And that, you know, we need to know, we're supposed to be the source of the source. So just remember, all you realtors out there, we're the source of the source. So when you have a question or your client has a question, have those links ready and have them available to your clients. So, and thank you so much again, Suzanne. We really appreciate you coming.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for being here.